Let me start with the CTS zoning. CTS zoning is this block. It extends up to through Sunrise. Other parts of the street, CTS is commercial town serving. It's been on our code since 1980. One of the things that got me interested in this thing when I started studying the CTS zoning is I realized it's incompatible with the street as we see it, in my view. Everything on this street except for one property, which we'll talk about when we get there, does not conform to CTS zoning. Everything is non-conforming except for the bank building. The CTS requires 200, for every 200 square feet of retail space, or every 250 square feet of commercial space, one on-site parking space. So if, for example, this site were developed with 5,000 square feet of retail space, you'd have to have 25 parking spaces here. On PUD 5, one of the things we've done is we've said you don't have to have parking for first floor retail spaces. Basically, we've through several provisions in the PUD 5 ordinances, we've eliminated the requirement for first floor retail parking, on-site parking space. So we don't have, the idea is to keep the street as pedestrian friendly, frankly make it more pedestrian friendly and get rid of some of the curb cuts, get rid of the automobiles driving across the street, and have a more pedestrian friendly Main Street. The Main Street character of Old Poinciana Way was really, I think, what everyone wanted to see saved somehow, and our charge was to come up with a way of doing that that provided what I will call reasonable incentives for people to preserve buildings and to develop buildings in a way that maintain the character of the street. Therefore, any new construction under the PUD 5 has to be developed in a manner that is consistent with the existing current architecture. Probably as good a time as any to talk about residential density. CTS allows for 6 units per acre, 6 residential units per acre. PUD 5 allows for 10. There's 2 exceptions to that. One is if you are reducing density down to 13 units per acre from higher numbers. We're going to see some properties on the street today that have significantly higher density than 13 units per acre. And the other is if you put your parking underground. Why do we care about parking underground? A lot of us don't particularly like underground parking. I don't particularly like it either. But the advantage of underground parking is it takes cars off the streetscape, off the property, and you can substitute hopefully pedestrian-friendly space. One of the principal requirements of the PUD 5, and it's a very important requirement, is that you have 30% public open space. That's open space that people can use, people can walk in. Susan, this property we're standing on, plus the bank building, are the only 2 structures on Old Poinciana Way that can go to 3 stories. And the 3 stories has to be 35% lot coverage. So it's a much smaller footprint. There are only, I'll repeat that, there are only 2 buildings on Old Poinciana Way that can go to 3 stories. This property, not the restaurant, just the gas station area, which this is about 120 lineal feet, and the bank, which is 100 lineal feet along the way. You cannot. And what you read in the newspaper today is, I'm glad you asked the question, Susan, because what you read in the newspaper today is absolutely false. You cannot go 5 feet back on an urbanistically contributing building, chop the back of it off, and put a 3rd story.
This area here that was all done in the late 1980s by the Testa family. That's when they built the archway that's here. But the open space in this property is something that's very important to everyone and is anticipated in the PUD 5. The restaurant itself breathes very well rather than a lot of the other buildings on the street that go lot line to lot line, and that's a characteristic that under the PUD 5 we would like to save. Now there's 2 things that are important about this. First of all, as Mike said earlier, under the CTS zoning you could demolish this entire property and redevelop it for whatever the present owners want to do with it. But if they decide to go under the PUD 5, and it will be their decision, this is an optional element. It's not for sure that they would do it. We need to give them incentives so that they could go forward and redevelop their property that's something that benefits the entire town and not just the property owners. So under the urbanistically contributing category, we've listed things that we love about this property and that they would have to save if they went forward with these incentives. But one of the things that we were also very lucky about in the PUD5 is that the town hired a fellow named Stephen Mouzon, who's an urban designer from Miami Beach, and he came and walked the street with all of us and developed some design guidelines for these streets. And one of the things that he said is important for a good pedestrian experience are small shops in a variety of different forms within a street rather than everything being uniform.
The contributing building report has 4 categories. The first is the highest, the architecturally and historically contributing. We'll see a few of those. The building on the corner meets that category. There's also an architecturally contributing category. Both corners meet that. The John Vogt wraparound, which we'll talk about later. Some of the other buildings, the building immediately west of the gas station where we were standing, is architecturally contributing. We'll talk about that when we get there. The third category is urbanistically contributing, and that's a term that Stephen Mouzon, our consultant from Miami, came up with. And that is a category where the building itself may not be architecturally or even historically significant, but similar to what Jane just described, the way the building meets the street, the way it depicts some of the history of the town. While some might say the Testa property is not an architecturally significant building, it does have significance to the town, and it does have significance to the street. The way the PUD5 is structured, all of the redevelopment goes through landmarks. The Landmarks Commission considers all proposals for PUD5, and the Landmark Ordinance is the governing ordinance for consideration of any redevelopment, plus of course the zoning changes that are in the PUD5. The question is there a limit? There is a limit under PUD5. You cannot develop more than 1.5 acres. There is no such limit under CTS. Someone could buy the whole block, demolish everything except for the Bradley House, which is landmarked, and build something. You can't go more than 1.5 acres, but there are further limits beyond that under PUD5, and that is you'll find that there are architecturally and historically built contributing buildings scattered throughout the block. So you start to get the picture of someone trying to buy this property and redevelop it and go out in different directions. They're going to hit buildings that they can't tear down. They can buy them, but they can't tear them down. So the disbursement of the historic and architecturally contributing buildings throughout the block is also a check on massing of some sort of huge city place type of development. Well, I'll talk about density in these 2 buildings because we're looking at the 2 highest levels of density on the street. Right here, there's 12 condominium units on 0.135 acres. That works out to density of 88 units per acre. That's the highest density right now in the 5-acre area. The Gus Moss building isn't much behind. That's 8 units on 1/8 of an acre. That works out to 64 units per acre. And it is the highest density that actually faces Royal Poinciana Way. I point that out simply because I know there's a very legitimate concern in the town about density, and I appreciate that and share that concern. The reason we picked 13 units per acre is that's the maximum permitted under the comprehensive plan, and we didn't want to go higher than that.
One of the beauties of Royal Poinciana Way is the mixture of styles, and one of the things that's in the design guidelines that Stephen Mouzon talked about is that we shouldn't have a homogeneity of styles within this 5-acre block. I think that that will do a lot to allay the fears that we could have something develop like Meisner Park in Boca Raton or City Place. We don't want everything on this block to be a Mediterranean revival. We want the block and any redevelopment or restoration or reconstruction that happens to take its clue from the different architecture that grew up over time. The other thing I want to say is I've heard a lot about we shouldn't do anything to change the comprehensive plan. Historically, the first comprehensive plan in the town of Palm Beach was financed by the Garden Club. I see some Garden Club people here, and it's a beautiful plan, and the renderings from that plan are in the town manager's office. Very few of the things that were called for under that plan, however, were materialized because they were very grand, some of the schemes in that plan. But it was a good start. The present comprehensive plan was enacted in 1989, and it's been changed a number of times since then. As a matter of fact, it's a document that's meant to be looked at and added to as the community's desires and needs change. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of people have talked about and worried about the fact that some of these buildings that are urbanistically contributing might only have a facade that's saved. This is not unusual for the town of Palm Beach. With over 200 landmark properties in the town, there's still 28 buildings that only have a partial designation, whether it be the front facade or a front door. In particular, look at the First National Bank. The First National Bank is just a great set of buildings, but it's only protected back to the first 15 feet of the buildings. That gave the bank flexibility. Landmarks works with owners. Our ordinance doesn't require owner consent in order to landmark something, but we've never come down hard with people with a hammer. We try and work with them so that something is a win for the town and a win for the property owners.
These are architecturally contributing buildings. From where I'm standing to where we were standing last, and under the PUD 5, they cannot be torn down. They cannot have a third story on them. They would have to be preserved under the PUD 5 and could not be demolished. Under CTS, they could be demolished. There was a question, though, I want to answer for everybody. The question was whether you could put a third story here under PUD 5. You cannot, but could you under CTS? And the answer is you cannot as of right. You would have to ask for a variance. And you could ask for a variance under CTS to put a third story on frankly anything along here. We have a provision in the PUD 5 that says there are no variances allowed on certain things. In addition to density, which is town-wide, you cannot get a density on height. You cannot get a density on a variance on height, on overall height, and you cannot get a variance on the public open space. So there's pretty tight limits, and also on the 1.5 acre limitation. There are no variances on that, sure.
Can, under the CT, whatever, can it be torn down?
Yes, under CTS this could be torn down. Everything on this street we've seen could be torn down tomorrow under CTS.